I mean, by that measure, you could say that the mathematician Ramanujan and the philosopher Ramanuja were the same person.
Right.
I mean, I can put a thus in front of it and say that thus the philosopher of Vishishta Advaita later became a mathematician and published theorems while working with British mathematicians.
Namaste and welcome to another episode of A Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and I'm very glad to finally have with me Jeysundhar. Very warm welcome to you, Jeysundhar.
Hi Sagarika, thanks for having me here.
So today's topic is going to be very interesting. We're going back to history. Jeysundhar has very in-depth knowledge of history, Indian history, and while he's a diplomat, he's been a columnist with regards to writing about history. His knowledge is typically found in those columns and Twitter threads, but I hope to see him published very soon with a book. And we are going to be discussing one of his topics of specialization, which is the Chola Empire in India, in a lot of India, and with specific reference to one of the articles that gained quite a lot of following and gained quite a lot of publicity due to the platform which the print provided. And this is part one of at least two episodes where we discuss several articles about the Chola kingdom that Jeysundhar is going to be part of. So without further ado, I have questions for you, Jay.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. So to begin with, let's talk about the article itself. One of the things I noticed with the headline itself is a very typical thing. Now, we are discussing a movie, Mani Ratnam's Ponniyin Selvan, and we immediately see a comparison to Islam and, the Mughal Empire. That I think when we talk about Islamic kingdoms, we typically leave aside the Adil Shahi and other kingdoms, and we just go on to the Mughal Empire. So, why is the Mughal Empire seen by so many authors in India as the sort of gold standard for empires to compare any other kingdom with?
Before we begin to attribute malice, let's first give them the benefit of doubt. And if we were to do that, the first and most obvious point why the Mughal Empire is, or to be honest, let's call the Mughals as they called themselves, not as the Mughals, but as the Gurkhani Empire.
Yes, right.
So in all of their records, they call themselves the Gurkhani Empire. It is a later name that is given to them by the British and others, where they're called the Mughals.
Right.
They never call themselves as that. So this Gurkhani Empire, there is, what we can call it is recent bias. They are the most recent before the British. And just before the empire begins to decline, under Aurangzeb, it reaches its territorial maximum.
But then we also have the Marathas, right? It's not like the British took over the country from the Mughals.
No, which is why I said before the empire's decline. The decline begins soon after Aurangzeb's death in 1707. Right. Okay, so under him it reaches its territorial zenith, even if not the peak in other aspects, but territorially, yes. And subsequently, after his death, it begins to decline. And it continues to decline for about, for exactly a century and a half, until the revolt of 1857 puts it to an end. So it is, the point that you made, it is not the Mughals that the British took over from. It is the Marathas that begin to control, even, just around the time of Bajirao. So we have historian Uday Kulkarni, who has written at length about the contribution of the Marathas.
Right.
So even during Bajirao's time and soon after, the Marathas begin to dictate terms in Delhi. It is with their approval and concurrence that things are decided one way or the other.
Sure.
And towards the end of the empire, we begin to have sayings such as Sultanate Shah Alam Delhi se from Delhi to Palam.
Right, right, right.
So that is the extent to which the Mughal Empire shrinks from the territorial peak that Aurangzeb puts it on.
Sure, sure.
But
So
going back to
then
the
again,
older
to your point, Jay, like you mentioned the recency bias, would that
yeah,
not typically pit any other kingdom against the Marathas if recency were a consideration? Or perhaps the Sikh Empire, which is smaller, sure, but it was significant, and in the same regions that the Mughals spent most of the time in.
that's a very valid point. We have as much records of the communication, including, the Marathas' letters are a very valuable source of information
Right.
that tells us about their period and their reign and their control over large swaths of India.
Mm.
However, that doesn't seem to have been studied as much. So, in addition to the recency bias, we also have a system, a sort of a continuation from, let's say, you see, the Delhi Sultanate begins, in a manner of speaking, with Qutbuddin Aibak.
Mm.
Okay, from there you have the Khiljis and then the Tughlaqs.
Mm.
Now, with Tughlaqs again, the empire expands to a large extent under both Muhammad bin Tughlaq, and subsequently it shrinks a little with Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Okay, and then you have subsequently the Saids and the Lodhis, who are succeeded by Babur. Okay,
Yeah.
now what
But the
happens
Lodhis
is
were very small, right? Like they just had some area around the Red Fort, and while other dynasties were, flourishing in the rest of the country.
what I was trying to say is that the Sultanate, and followed by that the Mughal Empire, it
Mm.
controls the most fertile part, the Doab. Okay, so that puts them at a very advantageous position financially, and because they control what is agriculturally the most prosperous region, the system that they put in place in terms of extracting land revenue thereby sets the tone by which other parts, which are governed not by indigenous kingdoms but by satellites of the Sultanate and the Mughal Empire, such as you have the Nawab of Awadh, and
Sure.
subsequently here in 1724 in Hyderabad you have the Nizam al Mulk.
Yes, right.
So they follow what is a shadow of the tax collection system that the Mughals establish, or rather what they improve upon from what they inherit from the Sultanate.
Got it.
So, because of this geographically expanded and subsequently geographically scattered aspects of the Mughal Empire, their system sets the tone for what is being implemented by others, even the Deccani Sultanates.
Sure.
So what happens is, even where the Deccani Sultanates or the Bahmanis before them, where the Deccani Sultanates differ from the Mughals, it is seen as a deviation from the norm, which is the which is the Sultanate and the Mughals.
Mm. Got it. But it's just that the headline
My problem
itself
with
was completely, commingling very disparate timelines on this. When we have the Chola king, and then we have, a comparison with a much later
Mhm.
philosophy. So, yeah.
My problem with the recency bias and large space of the canvas given to the Mughals is not that they are studied too much, but that they are studied selectively.
Selectively, certainly.
Yeah.
Not, yeah.
So if you have enough sources about the revenue administration of the Mughals, you also have enough sources that talks about the destruction of temples, which does not seem to have been studied as much.
It has, but it's not platformed as much because we've always got authors talking about it. So that's something I think we'll keep it for part two, where I was looking at I was just looking to study the recent articles, especially with regards to the Senghor and the recent publicity around it. And I came upon a lot of articles, especially in the print, which I really do appreciate as a platform. It tends to give space to more than one uh, point of view. Unfortunately, with regard to the Chola Kingdom, I found that most of the articles, save perhaps one or two of them, are
Mhm.
written by one particular author. I know you've spoken about him previously, but there's quite the platforming is of specific issues. But
Mhm.
moving aside, we'll discuss that author in the next episode, and perhaps we'll stick with this article for today's discussion. So
Mhm.
this article is written by Sudalai Muthu Parniyappan, who wrote this late last year. So it's
Mhm.
been a while. So it's gained it had enough time to be read by quite a few people, and I don't think it's been discussed the article as
Mhm.
much. Um, and we just go through it and break down some of the points that he makes throughout the article, and you can tell me if he got things wrong, or
Mhm.
perhaps he's discussing them absolutely accurately, or are the comparisons as valid as they should be in a scholarly discussion. So this
Mhm.
starts with the movie, which is Ponniyin Selvan, and
Mhm.
it deals with the Raja one of the
Mhm.
most famous Chola kings, because
Mhm.
of his expansionism and his ascension and the grandeur of his kingdom. So
Mhm.
we go to Tanjavur, and
Mhm.
we go to the culture that thrived there 1,000 years ago.
Mhm.
And looking at historical facts, they are talking about. So the author talks about how non-Hindus are not permitted to enter most Hindu temples. They aren't allowed
Mhm.
to be members of administration of charities.
Mhm.
Um, they aren't allowed to participate in Carnatic music and Bharatanatyam, which are essentially, they're derived from their
Mhm.
art forms derived from Hindu religion.
Mhm.
And those are some of the pain points that he highlights, and he suggests that the case was very different previously. Just to this point, I just want to add that this is the case across Hindu places. Not even in Bali, one cannot really go to temples if you're not a
Mhm.
practicing Hindu. I don't think you can do that in Mauritius either. You
Mhm.
cannot be part of any Muslim board of religious affairs unless if
Mhm.
you are not a believer. If you're not an Islamic believer, you cannot be part of a Christian board of education, or Christian Board of Christian Arts if you're not Christian, which is absolutely fair because it allows people to practice and have control over their religious beliefs, right? However, he makes this a pain point for Hindus solely, and then says that things were quite different earlier. Tanjavur, Muslim was superintending dancers and musicians in the
Mhm.
Brihadeeshwara temple.
Mhm.
So, yeah, this is the one point that I think he bases this article on.
Yeah. So let me just touch upon what he has gotten right in the article. Let's cover the positives before we begin to talk about everything else.
Yeah.
So he's talking about this one particular character, Sonahan Chavur Paranjoti. Okay. So let me just in brief touch upon what he gets right. Now, there was a historical character called Sonakan Savur Paranjoti. Let's call him as Paranjoti from now, for sake of convenience. There is the most important reference that we see for Paranjoti is inscription number 95 on the north side of the outside of the Brihadeeshwara temple in Tanjavur. Okay, what does that say? It talks about Paranjoti, as the article also mentions. It talks about Paranjoti donating 96 female sheep to
Yeah.
shepherds in order to supply ghee to the temples. Okay,
Yeah.
so this is one of his donations. Subsequently, we have another inscription where Paranjoti is with the title of Rajendra Chola Kon. He is given a position where he verifies that everything that Rajendra Chola's Asalam copper plate, that grant, everything that the grant mentions is correct. He's
Mm.
given that job of verifying this. Okay, there is a third inscription. Now, this is from Kolar in Karnataka, today's Karnataka.
Mm.
Okay, where his position itself is mentioned that he is Tirumantira Volai Nayagam. Now, this let me explain this position a little further. Tirumantira Volai is essentially somebody who's a scribe of the king. whenever the king makes a declaration, like if I were a king, I would say, now I donate this village to this person, and I just go about my way, right, to the next task at hand. Somebody has to actually record that down and ensure that it gets carried out. This is done by the Tirumantira Olai, who makes a record of this. Now, there is a set of these Tirumantira Olais who are headed by a Tirumantira Olai Nayagan. Now, this Tirumantira Olai Nayagan is a guy who is living in the town of Gangaikonda Cholapuram, which is the capital of the Chola Empire under Rajendra Chola. And he is living in the Raja Vidyadhara Peruntheru, or the great street named after Raja Vidyadhara. And he is the one who is Sonakan Savur Paranjoti. Okay. Now, as far as these three mentions of Paranjoti in Chola inscriptions are concerned, the article is correct. And these are the mentions that we have of him, and wherever he's mentioned as Sonakan Savur Paranjoti. Okay. Now, after this, after pointing out these three references, the article arrives at a conclusion, which is its punchline and also its headline, that he was a Muslim. We have no references for this. And in fact, the print has acquired a great degree of notoriety, at least as far as the Cholas are concerned, in publishing a set of articles which have a mix of fact and fiction, where the fact part is substantiated by inscription, and the fiction part, being fiction, is not, but it is the fiction part which is the punchline of the article itself. In fact, that is the reason behind which the article is being written. If it weren't for that fiction, the article wouldn't be written. So that part remains fiction. It is not substantiated by any sources. Now let's come to why this thing is associated with Paranjoti and not with anybody else for that matter. There are so many people referenced in inscriptions by the Cholas. Why Paranjoti? What is it that that makes Paranjoti interesting? What is it that makes this character of great interest to us? It is the prefix Sonakan. Okay. Now this prefix Sonaka is a cognate of the Sanskrit word Yavana. Okay, both Sonaka and Yavana draw from the same word Iona, which is a culturally Greek part. It is in present-day Turkey, but it was culturally Greek. So people that came from Iona were identified as Yavana as well as Sonaka. We have references to such people in the Tamil epics such as Silappatikaram. Okay, this term begins to be associated with the Greeks originally, and later Greeks and Iona originally, and later to Romans as well. Okay, there is no reference or substantiation to say that this was associated with Arabs at any point in history. At least the timeline that this particular author of the article is speaking about, there is no reference that says that this term Sonakan was used to refer to Arabs.
So this article has quite a few paragraphs actually where it's describing how he arrives at that conclusion, and it seems like he's referring to later texts where Paranjoti, which supreme being as the light divine, which
let's get to that.
Seems to be a very obvious conclusion, but then he goes to it does not refer to any god. It can be parsed into something to refer to Allah instead. So,
see, for that to be the case, to begin with, the article is citing a source called Sira Puranam, if I'm not wrong, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, it is.
Now, Sira Puranam is several centuries, not just several years, several centuries after the time period of the Cholas. Okay. It is a post facto reference that we are using to make a point about some part of history, which is not just unfair, but unethical. You just can't do it. Okay. The other side of this is that for you to make this point that Paranjoti could have been Muslim, and that this name is interesting, it means light, etc., etc. You will have to make this name a very unique one, which is not the case, because not only do we have the reference of Paranjoti, we have the reference of Paranjoti as one of the 63 Nayanmars or Shaivite saints. Okay, there is a Paranjoti who is heading the armies of Narasimhavarma Pallava when he goes on his Vatapi campaign. Okay, so this Paranjoti later becomes Sirittunda Nayanar. Okay, he's a very ardent devotee of Shiva.
Got it.
Not only that, because this article starts with Ponniyin Selvan by Kalki, we have to mention here that Kalki also wrote other novels, lesser known perhaps, but other novels, one of which has the title Sivakami in Sabadam, in which
Yes.
this particular Paranjoti, okay, this Shaivite saint Paranjoti, his exploits before he becomes a Shaivite saint, his exploits as a general of Narasimha Varma Pallava are covered at length by Kalki.
It's very interesting, right?
Okay,
Like
if you
you have the reference to one movie, one novel, using, and then you bring in a completely different character, and then you say that his name is essentially a Muslim name, or can be a Muslim name, or an Arab name, or something, and then you have another novel by the same person actually showcasing somebody of the same name being an ardent Shiva devotee, which just and I will say what this reminded me of when I first read the article. The Zirapurnam authorship.
Mhm.
It just to be honest, it seemed very similar to the later appropriations of Hindu rituals and any other pagan rituals and pagan days and practices and names and deities by later missionary evangelists.
Mhm.
So that's what it seemed like. Like you co-opt certain aspects, and then you post facto correct them to somehow create a sense of antiquity, which establishes authority.
See, it's like this. We know that tomatoes came to us much later, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So simply because you use an indigenous onion, a foreign origin tomato, on a piece of on some batter that you fry on a pan, it still does not become pizza. It will remain an uttapam. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is, Sonagan Chavur Paranjoti,
Mm.
there is nothing to say that his origin was Arab. Neither the part about Paranjoti, which is very much an indigenous name, as we have seen in the Pallava Paranjoti, or the part Sonagan, which has been used in the past to refer to people of Ionic origin, Greeks, and nobody else. So, I mean, the way the author goes about it is that thus we can be certain that Chonahan Chavur Paranjoti was indeed a Muslim. How? Simply because you put thus in front of a sentence, it doesn't mean you arrived there. I mean, in school, we used to do this, okay? When we are presented two sides of a theorem and we are asked to prove it.
RHS and
Yeah,
LHS, yeah.
simply because you say LHS is equal to RHS doesn't mean you've proven it, right?
There were a lot of steps in between, and we were marked for each step,
Yeah,
which
I mean, it was
that's
fun to do it in school, but
not
not
hard
in.
now.
It's fun when you do it in school, but not when you go and write for the print and do the same thing, right? I mean, I understand your nostalgia about your school life, but doesn't really make sense to do it this way.
Sure. Right. So now we find that he's multi-talented, and what I'm
Mhm.
surprised is actually he does not tie this Paranjoti to another Paranjoti, which has been the case with several other authors.
Mhm.
Just to establish more credibility, you've
Mhm.
gotten a title given to you, and somehow mixed them up with other people with the same title or same name and said that these are the exploits of that one person, which is not the case. People, somebody called George in the 16th century cannot be linked with somebody called George in the 12th century and then all have all of
Exactly.
their exploits given the same. Yeah.
I mean, by that measure, you could say that the mathematician Ramanujan and the philosopher Ramanuja were the same person.
Right.
I mean,
So yeah.
I can put a thus in front of it and say that thus the philosopher of the of Vishishta Advaita later became a mathematician and published theorems while working with British mathematicians. Doesn't make sense simply because we added a thus to it, right?
Right. So he holds a very important position. The author, Sudhaimathu Perlingappan, is doctorate and president of the South Asia Research and Information Institute, Dallas, Texas. Now, my question is: look, we don't have enough organizations. I'm generally a little hesitant when it comes to professing an institute with South Asia or Indology, or a department with Indology, or an institution with South Asia, because the kind of scholarship that comes out of that is, it has holes, and we keep needing to re-examine that. The thing is, it's an important institution, and it's based outside of the country, which is where a lot of our history is written. Actually, our history is written from a Western perspective, but it's also written by people in the West, and this seems to be the case here. So how can this be corrected? So essentially, when do people like you start writing a lot? So that, because what I will say that this article itself becomes, because he would have students who will read this, and later on they will cite this, and there will be a citation loop that is created from information like this. But there is no counter. Perhaps people thought it's not important enough, or people thought that it's accurate and we don't know enough to counter it. Perhaps it was true, because you have that very definitive, thus it can be assumed that he's Muslim. So that kind of statement needs an accurate historical counter, which I hope this video does to a certain extent. If you like this video, please go and like this. It really helps the algorithm. It's free for you, and do share do share it with people who might be interested. But yeah, how do you get more people to talk about such issues? It's the print. It's a credible source of, it's considered a credible platform, and I'm not sure how much editorship can
The important thing here is there needs to be a certain degree of critical thinking, not just on the part of the editor of the platform, but also on the part of the readers. Forget somebody with some semblance of historical knowledge. Assume yourself to be somebody who's, I don't know, 15 years old and never having gone through this aspect of history. When you read through statement A, statement B, statement C, and then there is a thus, you're obviously able to see that thus does not derive from A, B, C.
No, that critical thinking ability, I will say, is lost. It's lost now. I mean, I have tried to address it to a certain extent, but the thing is, our education system is flawed, and the age of information essentially means that information is placed out of context. It's a lot of information. The quantity has gone up, which means the processing capability of the people consuming that amount of knowledge is much lower than it used to be. I think it's absolutely fair to consume less information. Like, a farmer in the earlier days would be able to tell which day it was going to rain, because that was his job. If she were supposed to till the field, she'll know that, she's probably supposed to do it immediately, or it rains. I mean, actually, it's mostly the whoever was tilling were typically men. But yeah, if it was specialized knowledge, and it was placed in certain contexts. It was based in experience. We don't have a means of providing that. I've written about this recently in an article about education, and I will link it down below. But critical thinking is something that is typically missing. So,
I mean, if you were to scroll down the article, there is a paragraph that begins by talking about. I mean, it says, we know from ancient texts, Tamil texts like the Purananuru.
There's somebody who's not read it. How are they supposed to?
No, which is fine by me. But if you were to just bring up the article here, yeah, that one. So you see, it talks about Purananuru, where it talks about Roman traders as Yavanar, which is what we already discussed, right? Now, then it talks about West Asian trade passing into the hands of Arab and Persian Muslims, right? The next sentence, it says, later West Asians mostly came to be called Chonahar. How did you arrive at that conclusion? What is the proof for that? You cited Purananuru for Yavanar. Well, very good. But what about this West Asians part? What is the proof that you're citing for this? You're just making it up.
But people are not going to figure that out, because all of these terms are unfamiliar with, to them. If somebody does not actually know Yavanar refers to the Roman traders, they came by ship, they don't know this. To them, them not knowing that is absolutely similar to them, not knowing if they were also called Chonagan. So how will you
Yeah.
know?
And then he says, in the course of time, Chonahan and Yavanan refer to any Muslim irrespective of their origin. Again, what is the basis? You've just made a claim. You've again made things up. If you skip the next paragraph and come to the line after that, come to the last sentence of the paragraph after that, that begins with given the usual rules of,
Right.
right? The second sentence of this paragraph where he says, given the usual rules of Tamilizing foreign sounds, a possible Middle Eastern source of the name Chawur could be. You
My
see,
God, that's such a stretch, but you know,
the
I'm
could,
just
the could
genuinely.
is lifting a lot of the weight in this sentence here.
Hmm.
You see, the statement that is just before the conclusion, thus we can be certain, is actually a could be. It is not an is, it is not a was, it is a could be. See, these are your red flags. When you go through something, this is where you need to stop and say, okay, this is bullshit. Let me pay attention here. There's a strong could be.
Viewers, please note if you come across things like this in an article, please do use analytical skills to question could be's, maybes, and things like we should note, because we should note means that you need a source, and there are none provided in.
You see, in my line of work, we have something called plausible deniability. I'm sure the viewers know what that means.
Yes.
My point is phrases like could be are the article writer's tool of plausible deniability.
Sure. Sure.
He can always go back under the cover of saying, I said could be, I didn't say is.
Yeah.
But that could be is what his premise is based on.
So, just to kind of be very clear, if the conclusion is based on something that pivots on a very deniable phrase like could be, then please discard it. And don't have a headline that is based on that, because it goes with could be, and then suddenly we come to a certain conclusion. We can be certain that Jonathan Paranjoti was Muslim, which is a strange conclusion to derive from this. So that's interesting that it could be so, it's so flawed that you have three facts, three
References and inscriptions, yeah.
are archaeology-based facts, right? These are tangible evidence, and all of that is clubbed to come to an incorrect conclusion. And I'm being certain, I'm not really placing myself, because you've been certain, I'm basing it on my trust of you, that it's the wrong conclusion to come to. So I'm not using a deniability, any plausible deniability here, but it just seems like there's a lot of maybes and could-bes that are platformed in situations like this, allowing for the creation of something that can be cited later.
If there would have been a semblance of honesty in this, if the next sentence would have been Chonahan Chawur Paranjoti could have been a Muslim.
Yeah.
But when it comes to that, it is a certainty was indeed a Muslim. Like all your premise is a could be, but conclusion is indeed. How?
Right. So, just to move on from this, because I think it's quite certain that this is not an article written in good faith. It's based on flawed scholarship.
Yeah.
Let's go back to part of the article, which is Tanjavur. And, it's very famous for the Brihadeeshwara temple, called the Big Temple. I've been there. It's beautiful. One of the things that is cited about it is that the capstone, the Gopuram, is it a single stone?
See, the topmost stone of the Vimana
Right,
is
it's the capstone, right? It's not the Gopuram.
Yeah. So it's a single stone. Its shadow does not fall. Also, Santa Claus is real. So these were things that we believed when we were much younger. The thing is, it is actually, when people say that the top stone of the Vimana is a single stone, they are building a myth, but in truth, they're actually complimenting the engineers who worked on this
Right.
project.
Yeah.
Right. So this is to state the truth as it is. It is not a single stone. It is made up of several stones that have been brought, carved, and arranged together in the same way that if you were to slice an orange in half, how would this different segments of the orange be arranged together? That is exactly how different parts of this particular stone have been placed together. Imagine it is still a daunting task to lift a stone of that weight, to lift several stones of that weight high above and place them in such close proximity to each other that they no longer look as distinct pieces but as one whole. It is a daunting task. It is a major achievement. And it has been achieved to such finesse that we now see it as one stone. So this is actually a compliment to the master engineer Veera Cholan Kunjaramalla, who worked on this temple.
Right. It's a very beautiful temple. I would request you.
To actually give credit where due, the achievements of the temple are way too numerous to be recounted here. But the sheer fact that they did not use, any major, there's no major use of adhesives or to place the stones together. There have been different kinds of groove joint or interlocking joints that have been used to bring the stones together. And it is on the strength of these joints that the temple has been standing for the last 1,000 years, right? Not just that, it is a large granite structure, right? It has been built on the river bed of the Kaveri. So geologically, this part of the state does not have any granite structures which could have been quarried to get the stone to build the temple. So the conclusion that most people arrive on is that there is a place called Narthamalai in the Pudukkottai district, which is 70 kilometers away from the temple. And as the name Malai suggests, it was a rocky outcrop, and that was quarried, and the stones were moved 70 kilometers. Imagine that, moving 70 kilometers without oil power, without petrol vehicles to carry them over. Of course, now you get marble or granite from Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. That's a different story. But moving it 70 kilometers, stones of this weight, all the way to the temple, carving it, and then placing it with such precision. That is the point for which we credit the engineers of the temple.
I do believe that a lot of the older temples, right, whether in Patadakal or Badami or anywhere, the older temples that survive do not use adhesives. They are built on joints and interlocking joints.
Joints interlocking. There was also a sort of a mortar which used several different components to the mixture. That was used, but not to the extent on which we rely upon cement today.
Certainly not. But what I've noticed, especially even in Hampi temples, is that there was a chemical that was used to create holes. Some naturally derived acidic chemicals. That's what we were told. It creates holes in the boulders and the stones that were eventually carved, and they allow for the interlocking to work. I think that was a later development, but essentially a lot of the carving depended upon a lack of use of mortar or any other adhesives. So yeah, I mean, if one were to study Indian architecture from that time, it's just brilliant, and I wish there was more scholarship around that. So why do you think this
sustainable, long-lasting, and aesthetically appealing?
Absolutely. Why do you think this myth came about the Brihadeeshwara temple?
Because it is grander to think that it was a single piece of stone, and that you made a ramp for about 2 kilometers extending into the Sarapallam village, and from that village there was a long ramp that extended all the way to the top of the Vimana, and elephants carried with the support of logs as rollers under the stone. Elephants
Right,
raised
right,
this
right.
all the way to the top. It's just grand to think of it. It's even grander to make video illustrations, graphic illustrations of it, I suppose.
Okay, so this seems extremely similar to what is said about the pyramids in Egypt, right? So what was the same authors doing everything, basing one assumption on the other?
I'm not discounting the use of ramps in building the
Yeah, but
Brihadeeshwara
it
temple
just
or the Vimana, but still that different, individual pieces of stone were still carried above, and then placed together.
okay. Going back to the article, what do you think about the Cholas as rulers, as administrators? We've seen a lot of expansionism when they existed. They are
Mhm.
portrayed as being quite uh, extreme. So were they essentially their military capabilities are discussed
Mhm.
very often, their naval warfare techniques, and were they essentially ruthless military conquerors as the rest of the kingdoms are portrayed?
See, like every kingdom of its time, the Cholas sought territorial expansion. Okay, not just to increase the size of their empire, but also as a form of offense that would protect their empire from similar expansion by their neighbors.
Right.
So it's essentially a zero sum game where every empire tries to expand its territory at the cost of its neighbors.
Mm.
So, but the thing here is, you do not define a dynasty, an empire, or for that matter, any entity by what it has in common with its peers or other comparable entities. You draw a definition by identifying what distinguishes a particular entity from its comparable contemporaries. Okay, so if you were to apply this, the Cholas appear in a much more charitable light, because once the conquest is complete, you see that the Cholas do not penalize or do a sort of extractive taxation from the conquered territories. A conquered part of the Chola empire is undergoes the same form of taxation. There's no higher taxation that is done. The way the Cholas went about their taxation is very elaborate and scientific, if you were to put it that way. What they do is they classify the land into 12 grades or more if necessary, based on the productivity of the land.
Hmm.
And then taxes are charged based on this productivity classification that a land is given. Okay. Now, this is not only to the Chola Mandalam, which is the core Chora territory around the Kaveri Delta, but it extends to all conquered territories as well. The same formula.
Yes.
You see, it's not like I conquered this empire, these people resisted me, so I'm going to penalize them for the next foreseeable future. No, that doesn't happen. The same formula of taxation is extended to them as well. Okay, the forms of local self-government that we see in Chola Mandalam, be it the Ur assembly or the Sabha assembly, it's the same form of local self-governance that you have in the conquered territories as well.
Right.
Temples are built, grants are given, irrigation is promoted, including through investment by the state. All of this happens in the same way in the conquered territories as well.
Right.
To conclude, there is no sort of stepmotherly treatment or a sort of a lesser treatment that is given to the people from the conquered territories. We have references of both the crown officials or local officials from parts outside the Kaveri Delta.
Mm.
There are grants that are given by merchants living in territories outside the core Chola country. In fact, we even have references of a man from Sri Lanka, which by then the northern part of Sri Lanka becomes part of the Chola Empire. We have somebody from there who is making a grant, a donation, for the lighting of a lamp in the Suchindram temple in Tamil Nadu. So through this, we see that the same system of governance and administration that exists in the core Chola country is extended to the conquered territories as well. And there's no stepmotherly treatment that they suffer because they were conquered. And in this, the Cholas stand out from a lot of their contemporary empires, and even later ones for that matter.
Right. So administratively, they were very capable. They assigned the same methods of administration to territories they conquered, as well as did not subject their citizens to any burdens as such once they were conquered, and treated everybody pretty equally. Would you say that this is similar to everybody else, all of the Indian powers? And is there a difference between how we'll come to perhaps the Mughals later, but the Pallavas, the Pandyas, the Cholas, or all of these kingdoms, were they similar in such behavior? Vijayanagara kingdom.
To a large extent, yes. But what differentiates the Cholas is that the welfarist policies of the state happen at a much, much higher scale than that of their contemporaries. See, the Cholas are able to comprehend very early in their time that their country is very water starved. Okay, so there is a large amount of importance that is given to irrigation. Okay, the scale and expanse of this irrigation projects, which serve us to this day, be it the Viranam project that we see in the news today, which originated as the Veeranarayana Lake, or several such lakes, the Vairameha Tatakam at the Uttaramerur, the popular Uttaramerur inscription that everybody speaks about. The temple at Uttaramerur had a lake adjoining it. Again, an artificial lake adjoining it. It was called the Vairameha Tatakam. It exists to this day. You can see it on a map if you were to Google the Uttaramerur temple. So the irrigation efforts to essentially water this parched land in order to carry about agriculture. I mean, you need to understand that this is a millennium ago. There's not been any services exports. There's no industrial revolution. Your mainstay in the economy is agriculture. Right. And agriculture cannot happen without water. So the emphasis that the Cholas place even towards the end of their reign, okay? So the last rulers are Rajaraja III and Rajendra III, right? Even up till their time, we have not just the kings, but the local feudatories carrying out irrigation efforts. The state continued to invest heavily in irrigating the country.
Of course, they're very famous for their contribution and patronage of the arts as well. Why I ask this is also because recently I was studying about the Vijayanagara kings patronizing a lot of the arts, a lot of women artists as well who recited the Vedas, who were famous with regards to their music, poetry, literature. All of these were patronized by Vijayanagara kings as well. And I'm specifying women, but in general, they because that was the part I read, but in general, they patronize the art forms. Do you think that the Cholas were able to do it to a greater extent because of their wealth, because of their expansionist capabilities, and the kind of empire they had at their disposal at the time?
Partially because of their wealth, and drawing from it, their temple building efforts. So you see, the patronage to arts, both music and dance, does not happen independent of the temples.
Of course, yes.
Yeah? So it's so closely linked to the point we have evidence, we have inscriptions that talk about how Rajaraja, when he builds the Rajarajeshwara temple or the Brihadeeshwara temple in Tanjavur, it's named after him. Brihadeeshwara is a much later name that we attribute to it. So when he builds that temple, he brings 400 Devadasi dancers from various parts of the country, not just from Chola country. These were people who were serving in other temples. Now he values them for their talent and he brings them all the way to serve in the Rajarajeshwara temple. Further, they are given, it's not just that you brought somebody, now they'll, perform in the temple and that's the end of it. No. He builds a full-fledged ecosystem to sustain them. Grants are made, houses are allotted on streets outside the temple, streets adjoining the temple campus. There are grants made to the point that some of these Devadasis that were working in temples are financially secure to the point that they further make their own grants and donations to temples. Right.
I think the audience they may not be familiar with some of this. So I'm glad that you brought up the Devdasis. I just wanted to point this out when you mentioned that arts and culture did not exist outside, they were not floating art forms. They did not develop in a vacuum. They developed from a temple ecosystem patronized by Indian kings. And
Exactly.
this is exactly when the article mentions that, non-Hindus are not permitted to enter temples, and non-Hindus are not permitted to practice Hindu art forms. Now, to be fair, this is untrue. At this time, this is untrue. People do enter temples. People do there's a lot of issues with desecration and sacrilege that happens due to this day, whether in Bangladesh or Canada or India. However, that is an awareness that requires, at least in India, to apply the same methods that are imposed in any Hindu temples in Bali or elsewhere. The thing is, it also mentions that people are not allowed to participate in art forms. Again, that is untrue because we've got quite a few institutions, especially in the southern part of the country, where people of all faiths do participate. But it's again, the awareness is increasing, which is probably why the author mentions it here. The reason is that these were derived directly from religion and from temple activities, which, if somebody is not part of the belief system, then how can they learn within the temple ecosystem, right? You would actually have to bow down and practice the rituals required for those deities to be able to partake in this. So in these art forms, which cannot be separated from them. Sorry, I will go back to the Devdasis because I think there's a lot of misconception. I read a journalist who spoke about them rather negatively. If people were to go back just, I think, even 200 years ago, I don't think we have to go back even that far. However, perhaps 200 years ago, with the British Empire taking away control of temple and temple lands, that's when the decline of the status of Devdasis happens. Because prior to that, these were some of the most powerful people who lived, and with regards to societal status, they lived outside the bounds of marriage and the typical expectation of married women. They controlled how much money would be spent during certain festivities. They controlled what decorations were done. They controlled, and art was very valued at that point. Art, in any sort of wealthy kingdom, art is always given a higher status when you're not fighting for survival. And as such, they controlled, they taught, they were philosophers. And if they choose to get married, which happened, there were king's daughters who were Devdasis. So certainly it was not a profession viewed with
Contempt.
indignity. Sorry?
Contempt.
Contempt, yes. And
We do have evidence of Devadasis with married families.
with married families, they could, I think, also a lot of land was given to them. So once the temple ecosystem broke down is when they lost access to land and property. And now we talk about sexism, but imagine something like the doctrine of lapse and its earlier versions, right? If you don't have a male heir, your land goes away, your kingdom goes away. So it's been applied in the smaller scale when it came to the temple ecosystem. All Devdasis were deprived of their land holdings previously and had to resort to the least, whatever they could do to survive. And then there are records of them marrying zamindars and, leaving their previous professions as such. I don't know, did they give up their land holdings at the time when they left the system?
If you were to no, the land holdings, or for example, the donations and the endowments that were in place were given to them in lieu of service to the temple.
Sure, yes.
Okay, but more importantly, if you were to zoom out of this, the Devadasi system, and look at any art form, okay, the finer the art gets, the greater the emphasis of patronage.
Yes.
And something like music and dance, which was so closely linked with the temple. For example, I mean, we when you talk about Bharatanatyam, we have the 108 Paranas, okay, or the poses. Now, the 108 Karanas are actually poses that are held by Nataraja.
Of course, yes.
Okay, so if you do not believe in the existence of Shiva as Nataraja and having performed the Karanas, Bharatanatyam holds very little in terms of relevance to you. Right? So, similarly with music, the ragas are supposed to have their individual devatas, and performing them right is to propitiate the devata of that particular raga. Now, if you believe that there is only one single divine entity and nothing else exists but that, then automatically your relevance to these, or the relevance of these ragas and these raga devatas to you is lost. So you get into a sort of a structure whereby you are pursuing an art form without fulfilling the essential prerequisite to qualify yourself for the adhikara of performing the art form. Okay, and to return to the Devadasi system of patronage, any system that depends on patronage, when that patronage, for example, in an agrarian society, which was the pre-industrial revolution society, any form of wealth comes from land, right, and agriculture. So when the temple lands are taken away, when the temples do not have control over how their finances are run, the system of patronage that functions within the temple automatically breaks down, and the system degenerates. It not just declines, it degenerates into a form that we are no longer able to recognize as it would have been in its glory days. So one cannot interpret, just like you cannot look at an old man in his 80s and ask, how could this man have won the Olympic medal in the 100-meter sprint? Right? You can't do that. It's unfair.
Right.
Age has led him to degenerate. Similarly, the system degenerated in the absence of patronage, when that patronage was possibly with malice taken away, to take away any aspect of grandeur associated with the religion, its practices and its temples. This system also degenerated. To look at it in its degenerated form and say that this has been the case all along is very unfair and illogical, not to mention that.
Right. Well, I did want to clarify that, so thank you for discussing that, because that's something that has always bugged me. I know that we were either taught this in school, or the prevalent notion is that these were people who did not have any rights. They were the people who lived on the not patronage, but essentially poor people doing whatever they're equated with prostitutes, which is very unfair. And the funny part is, I've always found this, that when it comes to cultures which are not considered savage, heathen, like the Hindu polytheist culture by the from the white Western Christian perspective, for example, the geishas are considered a very cultured people, which is absolutely fair. However, it is so similar, except for because the religion has changed over time, because of the shift from the religious, it's not linked with religion. The geisha system is not linked with religion. It's linked with Japanese culture at this time. The thing is, they are discussed as upholder of arts. But it is so similar to the Devdasi culture, except with much more devotion and a lot more dignity afforded to their earlier avatars. And instead of those comparisons, we have completely contextless. This is why I was actually mentioning that critical thinking capabilities are deteriorating due to the school system, because you can have all of this information, but you don't know how to tie it together. Excuse me. An Asian system would make sense compared to another Asian system. However, we compare, the Kula Jati system with a racial kasta system. So,
Exactly.
Which is very similar. Again, this system is very similar to the Japanese class systems, not class systems, occupational class systems, which, if you read a 16th century book, which is very easy to read, I think it's written by a samurai. I will link it down below if I can find it. I think Book of Five Rings, it is called. he mentions how the job of a master samurai is very similar to that of a master carpenter. You can see that there is no contempt in the discussion of these two professions. There are different professions. He talks about how, as you grow through the steps, you are responsible for more, for understanding more carpenters under you, how they perform. You build a leadership aspect. You understand first. You start with understanding joints and how they interlock. Very similarly, you build your own individual things, and then you understand the other person as a samurai teacher, things like that. Now, that is a very fair comparison. But then we have a comparison, the imposition of a European understanding of class on the Indian
Not
system.
just an understanding, also a structure that is superimposed upon you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's like turning a circle into a square, because that is the frame that you have. You have a frame of a square. So to you, every object becomes a square, because that's the only frame you can understand things in.
True.
If something does not have four corners and if it's a circle, then you're not able to understand it. It beats your comprehension. Why? Because that's the way you've been schooled into.
Very true. All right, I have so much more to discuss with you. This has been a fascinating discussion, Jay. I look forward to our next one where we discuss more print articles about the Cholas, and see you very soon. Thank you for joining.
Sure. Nice talking to you, Sagarika. Thank you.